Police in the capital, Tbilisi, are dispersing protesters attempting to approach or break into the presidential palace with pepper spray and water cannons. Over 5 activists and demonstrators were taken away from the area. Local elections took place at the same time as these demonstrations. Opposition parties coordinated the protests, accusing the ruling party of having pro-Russian and dictatorial views. As his long-term plans to annex Georgia become clear, this is basically Putin's greatest nightmare. In every municipality, the ruling Georgia Dream Party declared victory. However, the 2 biggest opposition parties abstained from the vote, contesting its validity. After what they saw to be a rigged parliamentary election, the opposition began protesting more than a year ago. The government is accused by the opposition of edging closer to Moscow and abandoning its pro-Western, pro-EU stance. Vladimir Putin, who wants the local administration to change its stance in support of his regime, is not happy about this. The arrested could spend up to 9 years behind bars on charges of calling for the overthrow of the government. Thousands of people gathered in central squares as part of these large-scale protests. While some demonstrators tried to get into the presidential palace, several of them were observed carrying EU and Georgian flags. In response to the demonstrations, however, the local party said that Georgian Dream rejects being pro-Russian since its goal is EU membership, while keeping relations with Russia amicable. However, as Putin confronts the prospect of his propaganda campaign failing, the political turmoil and these protests are likely to persist. Significant geopolitical and strategic factors imply that Vladimir Putin would have the incentive and chance to take advantage of the upheaval in Georgia. Let's briefly discuss the justification and potential means by which the protests could both mirror and further Russian aspirations, as well as why this is so risky for Georgia and the region at large. Georgia is in the southern Caucasus, between Russia, Turkey, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, and it borders Russia to the north. There has long been debate on its geopolitical orientation. In order to stop what it perceives as Western invasion, Russia has traditionally viewed the South Caucasus as a sphere of influence. Early in the 20th century, Russia interfered in Georgia. Russia launched a more direct invasion of Georgia in 2008, acknowledged the areas as independent, and established a military presence there. The possibility of Russia completely annexing Georgia would not be unprecedented. In order to retain influence over post-Soviet nations, Russia has frequently favored leaving disputes unsettled. Georgia's political unrest may contribute to the nation's continued weakness and division and provide Vladimir Putin with more leverage. Georgia has long wanted to become a member of NATO and the European Union. Russia may perceive a strategic opportunity to regain control if internal turmoil weakens pro-Western institutions or results in a change of administration. The protest and subsequent crisis could create weaknesses that a revisionist power like Putin might try to take advantage of, given the present events in Georgia. Russia may covertly finance or back pro-Russian groups within the opposition or ruling parties in Georgia. Russia would seek to influence Georgia's domestic politics in Moscow's favor if they were successful. Naturally, Russia can also use economic pressure to chastise or compel a weak Georgian administration into making concessions. Georgia might be more inclined to make concessions that serve Putin's interests in times of crisis. Georgia's political unrest is not limited to internal problems. In actuality, it is a component of this larger geopolitical struggle between the West and Russia. The Kremlin would be highly motivated to use the demonstration to erode Georgia's ties to NATO and the EU, regain power, and perhaps even lay the groundwork for more direct rule. Normally, it would be reasonable to believe that Georgian domestic instability will ultimately serve Moscow's goals, but in actuality, Russia and Vladimir Putin are at significant risk from the protest. The scenario might backfire on Russia in a number of ways. Pro-democracy or pro-Western organizations in the other Soviet or Russian-dominated states might be inspired by a successful protest in Georgia, particularly one that opposes Russian dominance. In a place like Kazakhstan or Belarus, that is the last thing Putin would want to see. Moscow may exploit legitimacy among local populations, and demonstrations may continue or worsen if it is clearly perceived as meddling or interfering. Russia runs the danger of making matters worse if it attempts to step in. Russia's economy is struggling internally, and it lacks the clout it would often have in times of peace. In addition, Russia is under foreign military pressure, and additional sanctions are already severely harming the country's economy. A push on Georgia could be viewed by Russians as needless or irresponsible, particularly if it results in a strategic blunder. Putin's desired image of strength would be damaged by a defeat in Georgia. The demonstrations reveal severe deficiencies in legitimacy. The Georgian government runs the risk of further undermining its moral authority by escalating the division within its borders if it reacts with violence or arrests. Additionally, Georgia's application to join the EU was already on hold. The concept of entering the European Union is much less feasible now that protests have escalated, people have been charged, and the government has taken a tough stance. This contradicts Georgian public opinion, which supports enlisting in the EU. This fact is extremely concerning to Putin. His big plan is based on severing connections with the West, weakening neighboring states, and ultimately establishing a belt of Moscow-aligned buffer zones. Ukraine has already turned into a financial burden and a demonstration of Russia's military inadequacies. The demonstrations so far do not suggest that Georgia is giving in to Moscow's pressure. In fact, they demonstrate how strongly Georgians are resisting attempts to silence them. For Putin, this is kind of a contradiction. On the surface, Georgia's unrest may appear to be a chance. It is simpler to control, exert pressure on, and destabilize a divided nation. In actuality, however, popular revolts against authoritarian or pro-Russian regimes frequently spark a shift in regional ideologies. Putin runs the risk of making his glaring weakness public. He cannot afford for Georgia to be viewed by the West as the next frontier of freedom where a Western democracy takes control, nor can he afford another Ukraine scenario. The demonstrations in Georgia also serve as a reminder that the Kremlin cannot permanently stifle the will of the people. These protests are happening for a very obvious cause. These demonstrators are in Telesay to express their refusal to let the government trade away their future, particularly in favor of Moscow. The Georgia situation will continue to be a test in the months to come. It is anticipated by the Georgian people that these protests will go on until a significant event occurs. Will the ruling party exercise caution in its response? Will there be an answer to that query soon? What about Moscow? How does Vladimir Putin fare? These protests could be a turning point for Russia and another setback to its imperial project if Moscow's attempts to influence the local authorities ultimately fail. That is Putin's greatest concern over the Georgian issue as a whole.